All right, good evening and welcome to the Hatfield Museum and History Society's March Community Program. Tonight's program is This and That, an eclectic look at Hatfield history, part 12. I started doing these This and That programs back in 2010 after realizing that there were a good number of nice old photos in the Society's collection that wouldn't quite fit in with any particular program. Sorry for that echo there. Technical difficulties. All right, I started doing these programs, and when I realized there were a good number of nice old photos in the Society's collection that wouldn't quite fit in. All right, let's try this again. The pictures wouldn't quite fit in with any particular program, but are an interesting part of Hatfield's history nonetheless. And although some of the photos aren't the best quality, I think that any photo that captures an interesting piece of Hatfield's history can be considered a great photo. So I put together some of those photos into a program and called it This and That, an eclectic look at Hatfield's history. It's really starting to feel like spring outside recently, but this past winter we received more snow than we have for a good number of years. So I thought I would start off our program tonight with a collection of old Hatfield snow pictures. Our oldest photo dates back to the year 1908. Notations on this photo indicate that it shows mail carrier Wilson Moyer making his way down the snow-covered East Broad Street Hill in his horse-drawn carriage. The twin textile factories on either side of the creek are still a couple of years away from being built. Wilson Moyer is passing by a new home near Cherry Street that was recently built by Jonas S. Moyer. Unfortunately, a few months after this photo was taken, on April 13, 1908, a fire that began in Jonas Moyer's foundry building on Cherry Street spread to Moyer's new frame construction house and burned it to the ground. This was 2 years before the Hatfield Volunteer Fire Company was formed, so the Lansdale Fire Company was summoned. But by the time they arrived, all they could do was wet down the ashes. Jonas Moyer quickly rebuilt the home, this time of brick, which still stands today. The building at the right side of the photo is the home of Frank Zepp and his family. Mr. Zepp also ran a bakery out of his home. The Hatfield Times newspaper reported following the 1908 fire that the Zepp bakery property was badly scorched by the blaze, and only by the aid of a community bucket brigade was it saved. This photo, which I believe dates back to the 1920s, shows a group of girls enjoying the snow. 4 girls are pulling a 4-sled train up West Broad Street towards Wayne Avenue, while 7 young ladies enjoy the ride. That is the original Mennonite Brethren in Christ Church there behind the girls, which was built around 1880. This is the earliest picture we have of the church. To accommodate the growing congregation, a large addition was constructed in 1954. Here's Bethany Bible Fellowship around 1960, and you can see the original 1880s church building on the right. The original church building has since been incorporated into the present church structure as Fellowship Hall. This is the John Bolton farmhouse out on Unionville Pike after a December 1942 snowfall. And after another 1940s snowstorm. Although the barn and other outbuildings are now gone, the farmhouse still stands off of Unionville Pike just past North Penn Road. Here's a more recent picture of the former Bolton farmhouse. Back in the 1700s, This farm was part of a 359-acre plantation owned by Daniel Rosenberger. When Daniel Rosenberger died in 1771, the plantation was divided between his two sons. Son David received this upper portion and built a house here in 1780. He carved out a date stone with his initials D.R.B., standing for David Rosenberger, and the year 1780. In the mid-1800s, Daniel Rosenberger's home was replaced with this farmhouse. For many years, the old 1780 date stone was preserved in the cellarway of this house. In recent years, the owner of the building mounted the date stone to the garage wall here at the corner. A small piece is missing from the left side, but it is an incredible piece of Hatfield history. And it is hoped that someday this 241-year-old date stone may join the Society's collection. John Bolton moved from Unionville Pike to the corner of 40-foot and Coffle Roads and took these three photos after a snowstorm on February 21, 1947. That's the Bolton's brick house there on the right. Another photo from the same area. The field to the left is where the Penfield Junior High School would be built in 1964. For this photo, Bolton walked up to Coffle Road to get a view looking the other direction. That's the former Benner house there on the left. The rest of these snow photos are also from the late 1940s, I believe. This one shows men working to clear the sidewalk in front of the American Store and Hatfield Drug Store in the Knight Barn building. In the background, you can also see that men are working to clear the sidewalks around Knight's Hotel. The Hatfield Trolley Station. In the background, on the left, is Mary Main Miller's Oriental Cafe on East Lincoln Avenue. A youngster pulling a sled through a snow-covered Cherry Street, headed for East Broad Street. Many long-timers recall when East Broad Street was closed to traffic so that children could enjoy safely sledding down the long East Broad Street hill. You could again see the Knight Barn building at the end of Cherry Street. The Zepp Bakery building is on the left. That small addition in the back of the building is where the bakery's oven was. The Hatfield Trolley Station again, with a car stuck in some pretty deep snow. Here's the Hatfield Post Office at Broad and Cherry Streets after a snowstorm. And here's Harry Reinhardt Sr. working to clear the sidewalk in front of his East Broad Street home next to the post office. And another photo of Harry Reinhardt as he finishes clearing the sidewalk. And that also finishes our snow pictures. You may have seen that in December, the Society had a railroad watchman's box moved to the museum property. The history of the watchman's boxes in Hatfield go back to the early 1900s. In 1914, after a number of accidents, Hatfield Borough Council asked the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad Company to place a safety gate at the busy South Main Street crossing. The railroad rejected the borough's request, but did agree to supply a flagman for the crossing. 2 years later, in 1916, a flagman was also approved for the Union Street crossing seen here. The flagman, or watchman, would wait at the crossing in these little shacks from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., and stopped traffic with a portable stop sign when a train approached the crossing. The watchmen were kept cozy in the winter with a coal potbelly stove, and apparently, at least at the Union Street crossing, was able to pass the time in the summer relaxing in a rocking chair outside the shack. Around 1946, flashing warning lights, seen in this photo, were added to help protect the crossing, although the crossing guard continued protecting the crossing during the daytime hours. This photo, taken in the early 1920s during one of the famous Hatfield turkey auctions, contains the only photo in our collection showing the Main Street crossing watchman's box. And here's a closer look. You can see that it is essentially identical to the Union Street box. In 1956, the Reading Railroad approved the installation of automatic gates, flashing lights, and warning bells at the two borough crossings, making the crossing watchman obsolete. We are not sure what happened to the Union Street box, but the Main Street box was claimed by Frank Miller, who was the Hatfield train station ticket agent for many years. Mr. Miller moved the watchman's box to his property at 1702 Cowpath Road, which of course is where the museum is now. In 1959, Robert Botch Nolan, a former director of the society, purchased the house at 1702 Cowpath Road. In 1967, Botch moved to a farmhouse on Fairgrounds Road, leaving the watchman's box behind. Later, perhaps around 1982, when State Representative Robert Gottschall started leasing this building for his district office, Botch made arrangements to move the watchman's box to his Fairgrounds Road property. For a time, it was apparently used as a shelter for their dog. At some point around 2005, Botch made arrangements to move the watchman's box to the Hatfield Borough Public Works property for safekeeping for the Hatfield Museum and History Society. These are some photos taken after the building was moved to the borough. The borough did a bit of repair work to the building to make it stable and kept it safe for the society. Back in December, after having a concrete pad poured to set it on, the society was ready for the watchman's box. The Borough Public Works Department moved it to the museum property and placed it perfectly on our new concrete pad. And now, with the watchman's box on the museum property, the society plans to start work on restoring it as much as possible to its original look. We also have an original stop sign used by crossing guard Harvey Wimmer, seen here. And we even have the little potbelly stove that was used to heat the shelter. So we are really excited to have this great piece of Hatfield's history. Another new piece that was donated to the museum recently was this post office window. It was donated by the family of Evelyn Spaniger, who loved Hatfield history and was a charter member of the society. While she was living, she donated several other unique items that were a part of Hatfield's history. From information Evelyn supplied to her daughter, we know that this window was used in the post office when it was located on East Lincoln Avenue back in 1914. It was common for small-town post offices to utilize modular pieces like this window section, which allowed postmasters to buy only the pieces needed and to construct their post offices to meet the needs of their space. The photo on the left gives you an idea what the post office may have looked like. It is very similar to our post office window. Here's a photo of the newly erected Hatfield Post Office building on East Lincoln Avenue. That's the Heidelberg Reformed Church to the right. This 1914 photo shows Postmaster Jacob Hollenbach in the center. Wilson Culp is on the right. He would go on to serve as postmaster later. And the gentleman on the left is Ralph Swartley. The post office operated here until the end of 1922, when it was moved back to the corner of Broad and Cherry Street. We're not sure how Evelyn came to own the window. Perhaps she purchased it from another Hatfield antique collector. But when she got it, her husband Willard built it into a display unit for her little shop that she used to showcase her antiques and tollware items that she painted. And another view of the repurposed old post office window. Evelyn passed away back in 2002, but her daughter, Bonnie, always knew that her mother would be thrilled to see the post office window go to the society. So once we had our museum, she made it happen. She went to work deconstructing it from the shelving unit that it had been a part of for so many years. Here's a side view of the window. We then picked it up and delivered it to the workshop of Hatfield cabinet maker and wood craftsman Bill Miller. Bill worked many hours stripping as much paint as possible from the old window to bring it back to its original beauty, including revealing old ink stains in the wood. The frosted window glass appears to be original to the window. Many thanks are due to Bill Miller for donating all of his time and expense for restoring this wonderful piece of Hatfield's history. Thanks, Bill. This circa 1908 photo shows the double stone arch Lincoln Avenue Bridge that spans the west branch of the Neshaminy Creek, sometimes called the Little Neshaminy. This is looking north. The firehouse would later get built on the other side of the bridge. When this photo was taken, the bridge was still pretty new, built just 8 years earlier in 1900. Here's another picture of the bridge from around the same time, 1908. When the bridge was constructed in 1900 to carry horses and wagons across the creek, I imagine that the builders had no idea that it would eventually carry over 5,000 trucks, cars, and tractor trailers across it daily. Here's a view of the bridge as it appears today, with lots of trees obscuring the view. All of that traffic has taken its toll over the years on the 120-year-old bridge. It will be replaced this summer with a single arched bridge like this one, which will help improve the water flow under the bridge. This photo, which I believe dates back to around 1895, was taken at Main and Poplar Streets, looking down Poplar. To help you get oriented, here's what it looks like today. The house to the left was, until recently, Tranquility Life Spa. The Life Spa building was built around 1898, and the buildings you see here were built sometime after 1893. So that's how I guesstimate that this photo was from around 1895. Hatfield longtimers may remember that the twin house on the right was home to the Leicester family for many years, and the house on the left as home to the Kim family. If we take a closer look near the bottom of the telegraph pole, we can see a group of kids posing to have their picture taken. And there's two girls walking up the road, not aware that their picture was being taken. Here's roughly the same view, maybe a couple of years later. Perhaps it was taken in 1898, right before construction of the new home on the corner. This home is at the same intersection, Main and Poplar Street, only on the other side of Main Street, across the alley from what is now Sybert's State Farm Insurance Office. The photo was taken April 24th, 1920, and shows the home of Samuel Fassbender Sr. His son, Samuel Fassbender Jr., also lived in the home and operated a butcher shop here for a couple of years in the building on the right. This photo, taken around 1912, shows 21-year-old Samuel Fassbender Jr. on the left, his father, Sam Sr., who was employed as a trackman on the Lehigh Valley Trolley Road on the right, and brother John in the middle, as they herd a cow along the street, probably to the butcher's shop. Unfortunately, not long after this photo was taken, on the morning of June 24th, 1913, Samuel Jr. was killed instantly when he and his two-horse team were struck by an express train while crossing the railroad at Orvilla. The 22-year-old Fassbender left behind a wife and one child. You can see on the butcher shop sign that Sam's first name had been painted over after his death, and presumably his brother John continued the business for some time. Notice the beautiful ornamental iron fencing, possibly a product of Jonas Moyer's Fence Factory on Cherry Street. And here's a more recent picture of the former Fassbender home. This photo from the early 1900s is looking south on Main Street at Vine Street. That's the South Hatfield store building, which would later be Bean's store. A closer look and you can see a couple of men and two little girls standing in front of the store, posing for the photo as a horse and buggy head out of town towards Orvilla Road. After the January community program about the 1960 murder of Janice Decker, it stirred some memories in folks about another Hatfield murder, a year earlier in 1959. This was the murder of Harry J. Wallace. Back in 1959, Harry Wallace was a 52-year-old father of three, employed as the manager of Orange Cleaners on South Broad Street in Lansdale. It was a Saturday night, September 5th, 1959, that Harry Wallace sat watching TV in his easy chair in the living room of his home at the intersection of Cowpath and Lenhart Roads. This is what the house looked like around 20 years ago. But back in 1959, the porch wasn't screened in. Wallace's wife, Thelma, was working that Saturday night at her job at the Montgomeryville Mart, and the Wallace's 11-year-old son, Alan, and 3-year-old daughter were upstairs asleep. Their 15-year-old daughter, also named Thelma, was enjoying a night of fun at West Point Park. At around 9:30 p.m., an unknown assailant fired a 12-gauge single-barreled shotgun blast at Wallace through the screen of a side porch window. The shot struck Wallace on the left side of his head. Son Alan reported that, although he didn't hear the gunshot, he did hear some kind of noise downstairs, went to investigate, and found his father slumped in his easy chair, dead. Alan reported that, almost immediately, a man carrying a shotgun entered the living room and asked if anyone else was at home. Alan replied that he and his baby sister were there. Then, according to Alan, the man ordered him, "You'd better not call police about this," then left the house. Alan did call the police, and Hatfield Township Police Chief Harold Graham, Police Sergeant Irvin Thompson, Montgomery County Chief of Detectives Charles Moody, and the state police responded to the scene. Initially, 11-year-old son Alan was the police department's main suspect. The house was torn apart in a search for the weapon he might have used. A thorough search of the property, surrounding yards, the barn, and even the trees was performed, but turned up no trace of a gun. Alan was questioned for hours, but stuck to his story. Police eventually determined that Alan would not have had time to hide the weapon, and he was no longer considered a suspect. Members and friends of the family could think of no possible reason for the shooting, nor offered any possible person who could perform such a deed. Hatfield Police Chief Harold Graham stated that this was the first murder in the 200-year history of the township. A $500 reward for information was put forth by the Township Police Department and the Board of Commissioners, but without result. A week or so after the murder, Chief Graham received a tip that the murder was actually a case of mistaken identity, and that a man who lived nearby was the real target. This man was rumored to be suspected by the police of sexual improprieties or pornography prior to the Wallace shootings, and he was said to have enemies that might want to harm him. Another theory was that the murder may have been mob-related, since back at that time, the mob sometimes had connections to dry cleaning establishments like the one that Harry managed, using them as a cover for passing betting slips. Neither of these theories could be substantiated, and the murder case of Harry Wallace dried up. The Wallace family later moved to New Jersey, and the murder of Harry J. Wallace to this day remains unsolved. Here's a more recent photo of the house at 134 Cowpath Road. I want to give a shout out to Society member Don Lewis, who did a lot of research on this murder and continues to do so. I think he just might solve it someday. Well, probably not, but it sure is interesting research. For 51 years, trolleys running through Hatfield provided a quick and economical means of travel. The last trolley ran through Hatfield on September 6, 1951, after which the Liberty Bell route was abandoned. Within a week, the Lehigh Valley Transit Company had removed all of its tracks, fearing that another transit company might try to reactivate the line. The wooden track ties were apparently made available to those who could use them. The Hatfield Scout Cabin on Coffle Road was built with the wooden trolley track ties. In this 1958 newspaper photo of the Scout Cabin, you can easily see the wood tie construction. This photo was taken after an incident of vandalism at the cabin. Hatfield Township Police Officer J. Monroe Kriebel is shown pointing out the broken windows in the cabin. There were several incidents of vandalism to the cabin that year, and Hatfield Legion Post 933 offered a $25 reward for information leading to the arrest of the persons responsible for those mischievous acts. Unless you have a boy in Scouts, you have probably never seen the Hatfield Scout Cabin. Here's what it looks like today. It now has a nice log facade, so you can't see the trolley track ties anymore. There are at least 2 sheds still standing in Hatfield that were also constructed from the old wooden trolley track ties. For you Hatfield long-timers, one is on the former Paul Quintrell property, and the other is on the former Katie Algard property on East Vine Street. Little buildings with an interesting connection to Hatfield's history. Some of you may have heard the story of Peanut Jake Fretz before, but some of you may not. And since he was a unique local legend of sorts, certainly the only area peanut huckster I have ever read about, his story is worth repeating. Jacob B. Fretz was born in Juniata County in 1851. He was one of a family of 8 children. Early in life, the Fretz family moved to Philadelphia and then to the village of Calmer in Hatfield Township when Jacob was still a boy. His parents soon moved north from Calmer to a Hatfield Township farm located at Bethlehem Pike and Bergy Road. When Jake Fretz was still a young man, while riding on a train traveling through the Gwynedd Tunnel, a cylinder puffed out of the locomotive smokestack, ricocheted off the tunnel wall, back through an open window, and struck Jake in the face, blinding him in one eye. He was further debilitated on the 4th of July around 1880, when he was about 30 years old, suffering severe sunstroke, after which he was not able to do much heavy work, including the farm work he had previously done. Jake often wore dark glasses because of his eye injury and walked with the assistance of a cane due to his sunstroke debilitation. Perhaps because of these physical limitations, Jake soon settled on the humble occupation of peanut huckstering. Peanut Jake and his basket of peanuts never missed a public event of any kind. Every county fair saw him as one of the first arrivals, and in the old days of public auction sales, when hundreds of people turned out in horses and carriages, Peanut Jake was on hand. In his own words, he sold peanuts at every kind of event, except funerals. It was said that the success of any outdoor event, picnic or parade, could be estimated through an interview with Peanut Jake, whose sales of peanuts were in proportion to the size of the crowd. It was only the smallest kind of auction sale when he did not dispose of at least 5 bushels of peanuts. He and his cargo of peanuts, with the familiar cowbell, were on hand at every public outdoor event: fairs, sales, horse shows, and horse races. He would sell peanuts by the nickel bag, which he would fill using a metal cup as a scoop. The cup was marked J.B. Fretz, Lansdale, PA, and held approximately 1 cup. Jake used to give peanuts away to the children by the handful, saying, "Anytime I can't afford to give them all the peanuts they want, I'll quit." This photo shows Jake at his peanut shack around 1900. That's his peanut roaster in the center of the picture, and you can see the youngster standing next to a tub full of peanuts. When the great Hatfield train crash of Labor Day 1900 occurred, Peanut Jake turned up at the wreck with his cart full of peanuts, and the story goes he sold out of his supply of peanuts so early on in the day that he sat down and cried over all the potential business he was missing. In the early 1900s, the Treweek Town Fair in Hatfield Township, a precursor to the Montgomery County Fair, drew quite a crowd, and so you were sure to find Peanut Jake there. This photo shows Hatfield businessman D.L.O. Culp's food stand at the fair in 1909, and that's Peanut Jake at the far right with his cane. Another picture of Peanut Jake standing next to his peanut roaster. On the left is a wheeled basket full of fresh roasted peanuts. I get a chuckle from the lettering job on the basket. If you can make it out, he did fine with the word fresh, but ran out of room with peanuts and had to put the TS on the next line underneath. This is Jake standing by a wagon full of peanuts, ready for a day of peddling his product at the Lansdale Semi-Centennial in 1922. Jake made a hobby of collecting old coins and took great pride in showing them. Jake was a bachelor his entire life and lived on and off with his parents and other relatives in Hatfield for many years. For a time, Peanut Jake apparently lived with his nephew, Jake Frankenfield, first in Orvilla near the train station, where there was no heat in the upstairs room which they shared, and later at Jake Frankenfield's home on Cowpath Road in Fortuna. Peanut Jake sold peanuts for 50 years until 1929, when his health declined and he became a patient of Norristown State Hospital. His health continued to fail for 2 years until his death on June 28, 1931, at age 80, just a few weeks short of his 81st birthday. We just saw a photo of Peanut Jake at the Treeweek Town Fair, and I want to talk a bit about that fair, although not a whole lot is known about the Treeweek Town Fair. In fact, it may be that it only ran for 2 years, 1909 and 1910. At least that is the only years that we know it was held. The Treeweek Town Fair was held in the tiny village of Treeweek Town, also known as Hatfield Square, about halfway between the villages of Calmer and Lyne Lexington on the Bethlehem Pike. It reportedly was held on the east side of Bethlehem Pike, across from the former Treeweek Town Hotel. The fair, organized by the Montgomery County Livestock and Agricultural Association, was a regular, full-sized, 4-day-long fair with exhibits of livestock, farm wives' kitchen skills, sideshows, and games of chance and skill. They even held horse races up and down the Bethlehem Pike. The first record of the fair that we have found was that it was held from October 5th to 8th, 1909. Perhaps this was the first Treeweek Town Fair to be held. And this is the only photo we have that was taken at the Treeweek Town Fair. Taken in 1909, it shows the refreshment stand, the Palace Restaurant, which was operated by Hatfield's D.L.O. Culp. That's Dillman Culp, there behind the counter with the white jacket. His menu included 6 fried oysters for 15 cents, oyster stew for 10 cents, and a sandwich and coffee combo for 10 cents. For dessert, you can get some of Culp's famous pure fruit ice cream. He also brought large quantities of watermelons, bananas, which you can see hanging from the sign, and other produce, which he auctioned off to other merchants of the area. We are thrilled that recently a number of items from the Treeweek Town Fair have been donated to the museum. These are the very first items in our collection related to the Treeweek Town Fair, so we are extremely excited to receive these. Society member Tom Salter says that his grandfather, George B. Schellenberger, was quite the chicken enthusiast and traveled all over Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York, entering his chickens in various agricultural fairs. And from the 100 or so fair ribbons that Tom had from his grandfather, they must have been some pretty nice chickens. Here's a trophy that George Schellenberger's chickens won at the Treeweek Town Fair in 1910. the W.T. Patterson Cup for Best Display of Plymouth Rock Chickens. And that's a Plymouth Rock chicken there on the right. It was said that the 1910 Treeweek Town Fair was such a great event that it was almost as good as the big city fairs like the Allentown, Trenton, and Reading fairs. The schedule that year included Prohibition Day, with prominent men affiliated with the Prohibition Party as speakers, Democratic Day, Keystone Day, and Republican Day. Special events were planned for each day of the fair, with the leading feature event being the Special Milkmaids Race. This was a highly contested event, with women vying for the title of Montgomery County Champion Milkmaid, and of course, the accompanying trophy. Now, I had to do some research to learn just what this milkmaid race was all about. It seems there were at least two different versions of the race. One seemed to be a test of milking skill and speed. Who could coax the most milk from the full-uddered cows in a given amount of time? In another version, the pretty milkmaids would run 75 yards with a milk stool in one hand and a milk pail in the other to a waiting cow, and then scramble to see who would be the first to get in the approved position for milking. Apparently, no milking skills were required. In some of these races, the winner would walk away with a half-grown calf, a nanny goat, or a pot of old-fashioned apple butter. Which version was run at the Treeweek Town Fair is unknown, but it was surely a high point of the week. It's not known if this fair continued past 1910, or if this was the last fair held in Hatfield until the Montgomery County Fair held its inaugural event at the Hatfield Racetrack in September 1925. I mentioned that Peanut Jake attended the Great Hatfield train wreck that occurred Labor Day weekend, 1900. The crash occurred when a southbound express train headed for Atlantic City crashed into a milk train that was stopped at the Hatfield station. The horrific crash took the lives of at least 14 people and injured, maimed, and crippled for life more than 90 others. We are fortunate to have in our museum collection this lantern from the parlor car of the express train involved in this terrible wreck. The lantern was salvaged from the wreck by Chester Knight, who operated Knight's Hotel at the corner of Broad and Market Street near the train station. When the hotel closed in 1960, Isaac Detweiler purchased the lantern, and when Detweiler's store closed in 1970, the lantern was purchased by a Lansdale collector. When Hatfield Quality Meats heard about the lantern, they bought it from the collector and donated it to the society. The lantern survived the train wreck, only to be damaged 100 years later by a fire in the house where it was being stored. The globe was replaced, but other than that, it is all original, including the wick. Back in 2016, we were fortunate to have the brass bell from the destroyed locomotive of the excursion train on display for one of our community programs. Maybe someday that will find its way to our museum collection. We can only hope. To our knowledge, these were the only two items of memorabilia that existed from the 1900 wreck until just a couple of weeks ago. And then society member Tom Solder donated this piece of wood that his grandfather had that was salvaged from the wreck. Carved in the back, it says Hatfield Wreck, September 2, 1900. We are very excited to now have this in our collection. And it just goes to show you never know what other great pieces of Hatfield history are still out there somewhere. Here's a few photos from 1954 submitted to the Society by member Don Lewis. Don's mother took these pictures as she accompanied him and his first grade classmates at the Hatfield Consolidated School on a field trip to Wallace Durstein's farm on Elroy Road. Don recalls that the girls and boys lined up on the school playground before marching on foot up Fairgrounds Road to the farm. When they arrived at the farm, the children had the opportunity to see demonstrations of some of the farm equipment. Don is the young fellow in the short jacket talking to the boy in the striped beanie. Here's first grade teacher, Mrs. Fossbender, with some of the first grade boys and some of the first grade girls. We believe that this is Mrs. Durstein talking to the first graders about this piece of farm equipment. And the first grade boys paying close attention to the demonstration. Many folks have expressed a great deal of interest recently in this old house located at 103 North Main Street in Hatfield Borough. Many did not even realize that the house was there, since it was obscured from the street view until recently by trees and bushes. The house was built around 1875 and first appears on an 1877 map of Hatfield and was owned by Abraham Moyer. The brick part of the house, sitting perpendicular to Main Street, is the original 1875 structure. An addition to the original house sits behind the brick house and parallel to Main Street. Here's a picture of the back of the addition. Richard and Nancy Simmers purchased the house in 1964, but they soon divorced. Nancy got the house, and then she married George McVaugh in 1966. George died in 2013, and his wife Nan continued to live in the house with her 2 Pyrenees mountain dogs until 2019. For many years, the trees and overgrowth in the front yard obscured the house from view, especially so in the summer. The house was vacated in 2019, and in 2020, to prepare it for sale, many trees were removed to make the old house visible to many for the first time. Earlier this year, Society Board member Frank DeMaria and I had the opportunity to walk through the house to photo document it. So I thought I would show you some of the pictures so that you could see some of the nice old features of the house. Here's the fireplace in the original 1875 brick building. It's a bit difficult to see, but it features a fireplace crane. Fireplace cranes, sometimes referred to as chimney cranes or pot cranes, allowed cooking pots to be easily and safely swung over the fire for cooking and then swung away from the fire when done, preventing burn injuries to the cook. It was also used for regulating the temperature of the cooking pot. The fireplace was really the only unique feature in the brick house. Surprisingly, there were more unique features in the addition. This is the old door latch on the front door of the addition. The addition had an even larger open hearth fireplace with pot crane. And this fireplace also had 2 baking chambers. This photo shows the doors to the baking chambers. Unlike the straight staircase in the brick house, the stairway in the addition has spiral steps at the bottom of the staircase. and again at the top. After touring the house, Frank and I were a bit puzzled. You see, we know that the brick part of the house is what was constructed on the property in 1875. But the addition appeared to be almost as old. In fact, some features made it appear older than 1875. Our first assumption was that perhaps the addition was built soon after the original house was built in 1875. And then we came across this 1957 photo, which shows that there was no addition at that time. So now we were really confused. We thought that perhaps the owners may have had an old house moved to this location in the 1960s for the addition. This would explain why some of the features in the addition, commonly seen in houses built in the early 1800s, appeared older than the 1875 original house itself. But Hatfield long-timers I talked to were sure that the addition was constructed on the property. So then we thought that perhaps the McVaws bought an old endangered house somewhere, had it disassembled, and rebuilt on their property. Well, just this past Saturday, I learned that that wasn't the case either. I talked to a contractor who did a lot of work for the McVaws, who said that the addition was built in the mid-1960s from materials bought from various places. Old wood from one place, old doors from another, and old windows from yet another. They even had someone build an early 1800s style fireplace for the addition. It seems that the McVaws, who some describe as being quite an eccentric couple, had such a passion for old architecture that they had their addition built in the 1960s to look like it had been there for 150 years. The house is now up for sale, and hopefully someone will buy it with an interest in restoring these two old buildings. You may have heard that a 375-home housing development is in the works for the old Baum Farm property on 40-foot Road. Unfortunately, two older homes sitting on the 96-acre parcel will be demolished to make way for the development. One of the houses is the old Arthur Baum farmhouse. You may not even have been aware of this old house since it sits so far back on the property at the end of a very long driveway off of 40-foot Road, and so is difficult to see from the road. Arthur Baum purchased this large Hatfield Township farm on 40-foot Road around 1944. This is a great view of the farm and shows just how large it is. I want to thank friends Rick and Ryan Oliveri for getting some great drone video and pictures of the Baum property for me recently. On this farm, Arthur Baum established a meat processing plant, Baum's Meat Packing. This great drone photo shows the complex of buildings used in the butchering and processing of the meat. Many of you are probably aware that Baum's raised and butchered cattle on the property for many years, but we can see from this early 1950s Zippo advertising lighter that he also processed pork and lamb at that time. The Baum business continued until around 2005, and now, as I said, a developer plans to construct a 375-home development on the 96-acre property. Here's a nice picture of the Baum farmhouse. It was thought that part of the old farmhouse, the smaller building on the right, could possibly be of log construction. But now we are not so sure, and I guess we'll find out for sure when the building comes down. One of our Facebook friends, Michael Comfort, who grew up in the Orvilla section of Hatfield Township, recently posted some photos of the former George Moyer house on Orvilla Road. Michael Comfort grew up not far from the Moyer house. He recalled how at the age of 10, in 1968, he went with a slightly older friend to the house to buy 2 pigeons from Mr. Moyer for 30 cents each. He took these photos in the winter of 1973 at the age of 14. Here's an aerial photo to help you pinpoint just where this house was. If you are familiar with the Ruby's Plastic property, it would be on that property. By the winter of 1973, the old house was abandoned and people had started to break into the building. Not so much for looting, but just kids getting in through a back window and looking around. And Michael Comfort said that he was one of those kids. And once he's inside, what he saw blew his mind. The 3-story Victorian home was completely furnished from the turn of the century. Mr. Moyer had apparently, in his last few years, lived only on the first floor in a room or 2. There was no plumbing in the house, and Mr. Moyer continued to trudge out to an outhouse when nature called. The 2nd and 3rd floors looked as if no one had touched anything since the 1920s or 30s. Michael Comfort reported that he even organized a couple of late-night expeditions into the abandoned house to save old documents and books. Around 1975, the house, barn, and outbuildings were dismantled board by board and the construction material salvaged. Hatfield long-timers will remember when this small building sat right on Penn Avenue, right near Union Street, next to the Heston Swartley gas station. Starting in 1963, the building was home to Calvin Grafton's piano and organ store. These 1970 photos, taken by the Hatfield Borough Police Department, show the aftermath when a few bored youths decided that just for kicks, they would throw a couple of cinder blocks through the front windows of the store. Fortunately, neither block made a direct hit on any of the instruments, but flying glass caused nick and scratch damage to 6 organs and a piano, causing a total in damages of almost $1,200. 50 years later, Grafton's is a 3rd-generation family business now located in Souderton. This photo of the Jehovah's Witnesses Kingdom Hall at 1521 Schwab Road in Orvilla was taken on August 6, 1945. That's Schwab Road that's passing right by the building. In the 1950s, the congregation moved from here to a new location in Lansdale. It then became a private residence. Here's a photo of the house from a few years ago. Notice again how close the house sat to the street. Last year, the house was demolished, and since then, a new home was constructed on the site. If you're from outside the area or don't drive through Hatfield Borough much, you might not be aware of the changes going on at the old Hatfield Firehouse on East Broad Street. But before I tell you about that, first, a bit of history on the building. Although the Hatfield Volunteer Fire Company was organized in 1910, it wasn't until 1924 that construction began on the company's first firehouse. Up until that time, the firefighting equipment was kept in the borough building, private garages, or business garages. The fire company purchased a piece of land on East Broad Street from Chester Knight on which to build a new station. It wasn't an ideal piece of land. In fact, it was straddling the Little Neshaminy Creek. The fire company would need to essentially build a bridge on which to build a new station. And of course, to access the building, it needed to build a bridge between the house and the firehouse, or between the street and the firehouse. The new firehouse was completed in 1925, and this photo shows the new building all decorated for its dedication ceremony. Here's a better photo from around the same time showing the new firehouse. With an eye to the future, the firehouse was built to be much larger than was needed at the time. The fire company decided that it would rent out some of the unneeded space to help generate some revenue, so it converted one of the truck bays into store space. In January 1927, the Hatfield National Bank became the fire company's first tenant. A concrete vault was added to the back of the firehouse in which the bank's safe was kept. 10 years later, in 1937, the bank moved out of the firehouse and into its own building at the corner of Broad and Main Street. The store space in the firehouse was next leased to John MacArthur, who operated a grocery and meat market there. MacArthur's meat market continued until 1954, and then the space was leased to Vince Bowers, who also operated a store here. His lease was short-lived, however, as the fire company in 1956 decided it now needed the space for fire apparatus. The store space was converted back into a truck bay, as seen in this 1959 photo. This photo was taken 10 years later, in 1969, right before the fire company undertook a major construction project, the Banquet Hall addition. In this photo, you can see the concrete vault that was built behind the firehouse for the bank's safe. It would need to be demolished before construction of the banquet hall could begin. Here you can see that the vault has been demolished and construction can begin. And there you go. The construction is almost completed. And here's the finished banquet hall addition. Because of the firehouse's flat roof construction, the fire company was plagued over the years with roof leak problems and remedied that by building a truss roof over both the banquet hall and the main firehouse building. This also enabled them to add a second floor to the back of the firehouse, providing much needed additional space. In 1992, the fire company started looking at sites on which to build a new firehouse. With fire trucks getting increasingly larger and heavier, the fire company questioned the wisdom in storing this expensive equipment in a structure built on an aging bridge. They looked at many different possible locations in and near the borough. They eventually built a new station on Market Street, and in 1999 sold the old station to Hatfield Borough. The borough had originally considered renovating the old firehouse to serve as Borough Hall, but that plan fizzled. The borough leased the building for several years, and some may recall that a food truck business operated from the building for a number of years. In 2007, the borough sold the building to Crystal Rose Catering, who had dreams of growing their off-site catering business to include an on-site restaurant, including outdoor dining in front of the building. That never materialized, and the possibility of utilizing the former banquet hall for an antique flea market type business was explored by the owner. By 2019, the owner decided to sell the building, and Salter Fireplace Grill and Spa, who had not long before taken over the Woodburners fireplace business in the old Hatfield train station, saw this as a great opportunity to grow their business in Hatfield Borough and purchased the old firehouse building in November 2019. Since then, Salters has undertaken a major renovation of the building. They have given the building a great new look while maintaining the historic character of the building's facade. Stop in and check them out sometime. It was not until 1986 that the first public park was established here in Hatfield Borough on Edgewood Drive, although the Hatfield Borough community has a long history of desiring to provide a pool and park for its residents. Back in the early 1900s, John Groth lived in this house at the corner of Main and Vine Streets. It's a shame that so many front porches have been removed from older houses, since they certainly add a lot of character to the building. This rather ornate front porch certainly did. Anyway, he owned a rather large piece of property here in the borough, about 6 acres. As you can see on this 1898 map, it extended all the way from Main Street down Vine Street to the other side of the creek. Mr. Groth apparently decided to build his own little park on his property in the early 1900s. This circa 1908 postcard shows the park on East Vine Street right before the bridge on the left side. We don't have any details on the private park, and this is the only photo ever taken of it. It may have been taken in the early stage of the development of the park, as a number of trees look pretty young. And it may be that this was as far as he got on the project. The man at the left, sitting in what might be a sulky plow, is unidentified, but it may be John Groth himself or one of his sons. In the carriage are Gertrude and Georgiana Conver. The park entrance is now the entrance to the Outback Apartments, and the concrete base of the pillars were still there up until not too long ago. Many Hatfield longtimers will remember that the upper concrete steps also remained in that hillside there until 2003, when a new house was constructed on the property. And here's a view of what that area looks like today. While we are in this area, let's look at a rather unique house that was built on part of the Groth property. This is 119 East Vine Street, just a short ways towards Main Street from Groth's Park. The house was built around 1920 by Henry Groth and his son John S. Groth. This house features beautiful, intricate plasterwork in the columns and trim, and the molds for the unique original designs under the porch roof were made by Henry Groth. This is John Groth, a carpenter, and his wife Lillian standing next to their home. The Groths lived in this house until around 1949. Here's a photo of the house from around 20 years ago. It's a bit more difficult to see this unique house now with the landscaping that's present. All right, I started talking about public parks and how the Hatfield community had long desired to have a public pool and park for its residents. Way back in June 1937, the editor of the Hatfield Times newspaper, Harry Brunner, suggested in his editorial column that the borough should install a public pool next to its electric plant on Chestnut Street. You see, the electric plant used about 22,000 gallons of chlorinated water every day to cool the electric plant engines, and then discharged into the creek. So he thought that this water could just as easily be pumped into a swimming pool for the community to enjoy. However, no action was ever taken by Borough Council on Mr. Brunner's recommendation. In 1957, the Hatfield Adult Youth Council spearheaded efforts to establish a group to pursue a joint community pool for both Hatfield Borough and Hatfield Township. At a January meeting of the group, it was reported that several potential pool locations were being looked at. The Legion property on Coffle Road was considered, but the Legion was not interested. The property at the corner of 40-foot and Coffle Road, the site of a proposed junior high school, was also considered. Mary Miller, who operated the Oriental Cafe on East Lincoln Avenue in the borough, offered to sell her restaurant property for use as a park and pool. The committee apparently did not pursue this offer. By the spring of 1958, the nonprofit corporation had entered into an agreement of sale to purchase a 6.8-acre parcel of land off of West Vine Street near Coffle Road, between Vine Street and Orvilla Road. Bids were solicited for the construction of an L-shaped pool, and the group began to attempt to raise funds for the pool through the sale of pool bonds. Meanwhile, in June of 1958, borough resident Layden Berge donated the use of a wooded lot on Edgewood Drive to the borough for a park. The overgrown lot was cleaned up by the borough, but not developed into a park at that time. By December of 1958, it was reported that there appeared to be a lack of community support in the West Vine Street pool project. The Borough Lions Club joined in the effort to raise support for the project, but it was eventually abandoned. Then, in 1965, Hatfield Borough and Hatfield Township entered into an agreement to jointly purchase 33 acres on East Vine Street in Hatfield Township for the purpose of operating Hatfield's first municipal park and swimming pool. The Hatfield Community Pool opened a few years later. This is a 1970s photo of the Hatfield Community Pool. In 1986, Hatfield Borough finally developed its first public park, Edgewood Park. Since then, Hatfield Borough and Hatfield Township have both made great strides in providing many more parks, both active and passive, as well as a wonderful trail system for its residents. And that is it for tonight. I hope that you enjoyed our program. Click on the donate button if you would like to make a little donation to support the work of the Society. And we hope that you join us in a couple of months for our May Community Program. Thanks for watching, and good night.